a fear-monger, fear-based, spiritually retarded, vibrationally challenged, whatever the euphemism may be, right? And see, that is very invalidating, and it's very disrespectful of the people that have had the experiences. And what's interesting also is, often as not, when I come across people who claim to only have had positive experiences with good aliens, again, when these subjects come up, they get agitated, they reach for a cigarette, they start whinging about how the information that myself and or my colleagues share is so negative and fear-based. But my goal is to provide validation to those having the negative experiences, to provide a conceptual framework so they can understand the nature of their experiences and the methodologies utilized by the negative ETs to essentially program them and use them in a variety of ways which completely undermines their personal sovereignty and dignity. So that much being said, let us start. Now, this is an important case, and I won't go into the whole psychodrama of how the eyewitness of this case, Fiona Hartigan, had her life basically destroyed by the local debunkers here in Sydney. Fiona Hartigan made the mistake of contacting the major media here in Sydney and shared with them some photographs she'd taken on her way home from work. She was coming home around dusk in Chipping Norton, and she felt that it was such a beautiful sunset that she ought to pull over and take a series of pictures. And she did. She pulled over to the side of the road, to the shoulder, got out of her car, and took a series of photographs. Lo and behold, what she saw during the experience of taking the photos and what showed up in the imagery later was far more than just the sunset. And it's important that I emphasize this case because it dovetails perfectly with some of the cases and the types of research that I do and my colleagues do. What you're looking at is an actual wormhole, an actual stargate, which appeared above the tree canopy on the stretch of road. A little further down is a bridge. A stargate appeared up in the upper right. You see that searing light. Now, the local debunkers try to say that was a lamplight. That's just asinine. And moreover, I stood beneath that tree. There is no bloody lamplight there. I personally investigated this case. I spent over 12 hours speaking with Fiona Hartigan. I debriefed her thoroughly. What happened was the stargate opened up, and then a number of these metallic spherical craft flew out of it. And at one point, 2 craft flew out of it after some others, and 1 craft flew off in one direction and another craft flew off in another. There is a researcher in the UK who did the analysis of this series of pictures, and he determined that this was indeed a traversable, i.e. moving wormhole, because based on the series of pictures, the location of the wormhole directly above the canopy, and then its location at the end of the sequence of pictures, it had moved before it blinked out. Now, this is an extremely important case. I understand the value of imagery like you've been seeing before I got here. I understand the value of UFO reports, so on and so forth, but I am really interested in the hardcore information where the rubber meets the road, which is why I'm particularly interested in the encounter experiences that people have with ETs and other non-human beings, sometimes subterrestrial beings. Now, this is not a run-of-the-mill UFO sighting. This is an actual example of craft flying out of an active wormhole. Now, it's purely conjectural on my part, but I would suggest that the other side of that wormhole may be at or very close to perhaps the sun or a star, because it's well known in esoteric lore that stars are actually stargates, and in some of the subsequent slides I'll show you, you will get an example of that. And here's a close-up. Again, that's not a lamplight. That is a searing light that's coming out of an opening, and you see that metallic object right there. Now, the debunkers said it's characteristic of debunkers that they routinely misrepresent, mischaracterize, and outright lie about the testimony of the eyewitnesses. In this case, they switched it all around and said, well, she didn't get out of her car and took the photos like she said. That craft you see in the center of the picture, that's a sultana, the debunkers said. To any Americans in the audience, that's a raisin. Okay? Yes, they said that's a sultana, and basically she was lying. Long story short, and I won't elaborate on it, but this case highlights all that is good and all that is bad about mainstream ufology. This witness, Fiona Hartigan, had her life destroyed by this particular debunker and his accomplices. I'll call them Lens Flare and his merry band of Flarians. What happened was they trolled her Facebook page. They came up with 76 pages thereabouts of venomous abuse that they meted out to her on Above Top Secret. And those same trolls at Above Top Secret fluttered onto her Facebook page. They also fluttered onto the comment section of the major newspaper in which this story was featured, to the point that Fiona's children began to be bullied at school. Fiona's health suffered radically. At one point, it was touch and go whether she would survive, and it almost destroyed her marriage. Now, I would encourage people, when they have these kinds of experiences and these sightings, to leave the mainstream corporate media out of the equation. We don't need them. We have the internet. We have social media. We don't need to go hat in hand, oh, please, please, look at the great work we've done. They've been a fundamental part of keeping a lid on this story and ridiculing and mocking witnesses for decades, since at least 1953, when the CIA started this comprehensive debunking and ridiculing program, utilizing paid academics and utilizing the corporate media. Traversable wormholes. Keep this point in mind. And there's a couple of more photos, close-ups. I mean, I've personally investigated a number of cases. I've walked the ground. This is one of the outstanding cases I've ever investigated. I must say that it's not any surprise to any of you, but you happen to live in a mega UFO hotspot. Now, where I come from, the southwestern desert of the U.S., San Diego, California, places like that, unless we knew someone who was having frequent experiences within the nearby locale, we had to drive hours out into the desert, out into some remote mountaintop somewhere to get this kind of activity. And I must say, this kind of activity, because there are natural occurring stargates and artificially generated portals and stargates all over the planet. Indeed, the Aborigines, the Native American elders, so on and so forth, they utilize the worldwide grid of portals to get around. This is why Aboriginal skeletons are found in North America, South America, all over the place. So we no longer need to go hand in hand to the corporate media and try to seek their approval. We can bypass them. This is an outstanding case. And a close-up. That is my late great mentor, Barbara Bartholick. I was a protege of hers. Her first and foremost protege was Dr. Carla Turner, Candy to her friends. And Barbara was my spiritual mama. She did 30 years of alien abduction research, regressed countless alien abductees, knew the ins and outs of the alien abduction internal dynamics. And I was blessed to have her as a mentor and a teacher in this life. She passed over to the other side of the veil a couple of years back. Out of the Barbara Bartholick researcher tree, if you will, next after her came Dr. Carla Turner. She passed away in January. Well, I gave a memorial speech on Candy Turner's behalf in Philadelphia in 97, January 97. She passed away shortly before that, of course. But Dr. Carla Turner inspired me, and she inspired a lot of other people, because Dr. Carla Turner did not shrink from the hardcore information. Okay. I want people to start thinking about an expanded arena. This is what is going on. Now, some of you are familiar with this image. I'll show you a close-up. Jaime Maussan is the presenter of Mexico's version of 60 Minutes. It's called 60 Minutos or something over there. Now, he did a segment of this on his show. Now, this is mainstream media in Mexico. Think about this. This spherical object parked right in front of the sun for 80 hours, and it seemed to gas up from the plasma of the sun. And those of you that are familiar with Wal Thornhill's work and others, the plasma electric model of the universe is the correct model of the universe, of stellar formation, galactic formation, etc., etc. I have no patience with lamestream scientists who constantly invoke the bogus science. They can't even get basic concepts like stellar formation correct, or basic concepts like what are comets. For example, when Comet Ison passed by Mars, it sparked Mars up. Mars turned green for a while. Dirty ice balls shouldn't be able to do that. That's why suddenly, on that particular day, NASA and other federal agencies were sent packing, because there was no money in the till to run operations for that particular day when Ison was passing Mars. Incidentally, what's interesting too, if you find a book out there called Phoenix Rising, the visions of the future Earth changes by No Wise. No Wise was a Native American Chippewa shamanist. She said there's going to come a point in time, and she described a whole bunch of other Earth changes, sinkholes, etc., etc. She said there's going to come a point in time when our atmosphere will turn green. Now, isn't it interesting that Mars' atmosphere turned green in a plasma electric interaction with Ison as it passed? Anyhow, back to the frame. We can see that that sphere, which is several times larger than this planet, is drawing this plasma energy from the sun. It did this for about 80 hours, and then it flew away. And this is just one of many examples. This imagery was from the Soho Observatory. Here is another very large craft, Saturn-shaped. Again, an expanded arena. We have to start thinking big. We've got to start thinking in galactic cosmic scales. The debunkers of the world want to keep this at arm's length. They want to keep it at a lights in the sky level. Because lights in the sky ultimately are transient events, will-o'-the-wisp, maybe some to it, maybe not. Really can't sink your teeth into it. That is very interesting, if you ask me. Okay, and here's the incoming fleet. Now, what I'd like to do is show a quick video, if you don't mind, Paul, hitting that. Some of you have already seen this. There's an outfit in the UK called the Alien Disclosure Group. And get a load of this. Again, we're talking stargates and portals. It seems obvious to me that there is, in Stargate SG-1 terms, an event horizon that the camera is imaging side on, because the craft that begin to manifest seem to be exiting stage right from our perspective. You can see it's like there's a cutoff point there where they just seem to be coming out. We don't see any here. It's possible that they're teleporting and they're manifesting right there. My intuitive feel about this is that they are exiting a large stargate somewhere within our solar system. I believe that imagery was taken by the International Space Station, but don't quote me on that. And I must give credit to all the people online, the people in the Alien Disclosure Group and others like them who spend thousands of man hours and woman hours scanning all this space imagery, looking for anomalies like this. For example, another very good site you can find online is the Mars Anomalies Research website by Joseph P. Skippers. All kinds of anomalies on the Mars, on the surface of Mars. Nowadays, whenever the Curiosity images something, the standard pat excuse is, it's a rock that looks like a skull. It's a rock that looks like a lizard. It's a rock that looks like a squirrel, right? Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Again, an expanded arena. Let's think big. Let's think beyond the solar system. Because many of you people here, whether you realize it or not, and you're starting to catch on, at least some of you already know, you've been involved in this subject, this celestial, cosmic, actual confrontation against the Draco reptilian overlords for many lifetimes. Some of you had lifetimes long before you came to Earth and started incarnating as Terrans. Okay, here's another thing that must be taken into account. Our planet has been subjected to celestially driven cataclysms over time. The last time this solar system, not just this planet, but this solar system was really hammered was 12,500 years ago, give or take a couple of thousand years. And I believe that it was a series of events. It was the galactic superwave event described by Dr. Paul Laviolette, essentially a tremendous energetic burst from the center of the galactic core, which come into the solar system. They push in the cosmic dust from beyond the solar system, which results in the heavens and the sun and the moon being blotted out, so on and so forth. The sun starts cooking off all the cosmic dust, and then fire literally rains down from the heavens, melts the poles, causing tsunami, glacial tsunami, so on and so forth. And then at the tail end of that, I do believe a rather large comet or comets came through the solar system. And the end result was probably a pole shift, crustal displacement, something along those lines. Now, what comes around sooner than this galactic superwave event and the return of these very large planet-sized comets is this sister solar system. Call it Nibiru, call it Wormwood, Herculobus. I've been tracking this for a long time now, and I happen to be plugged into a network of outstanding Planet X researchers. Now, this is just an example. There's some call that body in the middle a brown dwarf, and it seems to have its own solar system around it. And according to some sources, there may be as many as 10 bodies surrounding that central sun. And everything is based on scale. I mean, that may look like a so-called brown dwarf vis-a-vis our star, but remember, our star looks like a marble compared to Betelgeuse. Okay, everything, again, scale, so on and so forth. Here's a close-up. Now, my intuitive feeling, I know some of you have had these too. Some of you have had recurring dreams of tsunamis, of floods, of fireballs, of earth changes of all kinds, civil unrest, which results from all the earth changes. Well, the fact of the matter is, these celestially driven cataclysms have seared themselves into our collective unconsciousness. They've seared themselves into our very DNA. And our own planet is ample proof that we have endured, we being this planet, tremendous geological upheavals. And remember, 12,500 years ago, thereabouts, in terms of geological time, that was last week. And we're on the cusp of these again. Now, all of these futuristic visions that people have had, myself included, they remain probabilities. Probabilities in a multiverse of probabilities. It doesn't mean they have to happen. I am of the opinion that we have had some help from positive beings that have somewhat slowed or mitigated the consequences of these incoming celestial bodies, including comets. I can't help but feel that things could have gotten a lot worse and spiraled out of control by now, but that's just my take on it. Okay, now we're getting to the MyLab part of it. one of the most important cases of all time is the Roswell case, and I won't go on over that for too long. Suffice to say that Roswell is the case that makes the case. There are at least 100 first and second-hand eyewitnesses to the crash retrieval of more than one craft, and there were not only eyewitnesses in New Mexico, but in the other military bases where some of the wreckage, some of the technology, and the bodies, living and dead, were taken to. So it must be understood that when one civilization acquires technology, weaponry, whatever the case may be, from another civilization, they almost invariably incorporate said technology. To give just a few examples from history, when the Romans first went to the Iberian Peninsula, they came across the fierce Celtiberian mountain tribes. The Celtiberian mountain tribes had a short sword. The Romans adopted that short sword. It became known throughout history as the gladius, the Celtiberian gladius. When you see the logo of the Special Air Service, people say, oh, that's a winged dagger. No, that's the Roman gladius sword. It's a weapon of empire. When the Germans found a nearly intact Russian T-34 in the northern sector, Army Group North area near Leningrad, the T-34 had a wide chassis, sloped frontal armor, a large caliber cannon. German engineers got to work and created their response to the T-34, which we know was the Kampfwagen Mark V Panther. When the Japanese left the plane in the Aleutian Islands, a nearly intact Mitsubishi Zero, when the Americans invaded the Aleutian Islands, they found this nearly intact Japanese Mitsubishi Zero on the ground. They brought it back to my old stomping grounds, what's now known as Naval Air Station North Island, what used to be known as Rockwell Field. They had American test pilots have a go with it, flying around the Mitsubishi Zero, and out of that, Grumman aircraft built the Grumman F-6F Hellcat as a means to counter the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero. We have the same thing here, because some of these researchers, despite their best efforts, they won't debunk Roswell, and Roswell was a tip of the iceberg. Aztec, New Mexico, March 1948, Kingman, Arizona, 1953, so on and so forth. There was numerous crash retrievals. He is a very important witness. This is, I'm sure some of you heard the story. The late Ben Rich was the director of the Skunk Works, which is Lockheed's Advanced Development Programs Division. He was a protege himself of Kelly Johnson, the founder of the Skunk Works, and it was under Kelly Johnson and Ben Rich's supervision that the U-2, the Aurora, and a number of other spy planes and now hypersonic craft have been developed. Ben Rich, prior to his death, gave what amounts to a deathbed confession to, I believe his name was Tom Kelleher, who was a MUFON consultant with an aerospace background. And Tom Kelleher interviewed Ben Rich, and the outcome of the interview was the following. Ben Rich admitted, yes, there are real alien UFOs and there are man-made UFOs. He admitted that it will not take centuries or a lifetime to travel to other star systems. He said, this is a very interesting statement, he said, we found an error in the equations. We found an error in the equations. We made the correction, and now the military traveled the stars. Now, what are the equations? I mean, my guess would be probably Einstein's famous equation, right? Just bear with me as I get a drink of water here. Thanks. Thank you. He said we have small fleets of craft based on alien technology, which we've recovered, and also, which he didn't come out and say, but there has been this ongoing interaction between non-human life forms and deep black elements of the military aerospace community, which I will talk about shortly. This is just a lead up to all that. So he also said something that was very interesting, which is absolutely connected with all of this. He said he was asked how the propulsion or navigation worked, and Ben Rich said to Tom Kelleher, he said, "I've got a question for you. How does ESP work?" And then Tom Kelleher, if memory serves, said something to the effect that all time and space is one. Ben Rich replied, "Exactly, that's how it's done." You see, inside the craft, these beings, they have this symbiotic link with their technology. Some of the technology is extremely advanced, as you know, and it responds instantaneously to the mental commands of the entities. If they want to create a portal or a hatch here, a hatch manifest, it's what's been described as organic technology. Organic technology. Some of the really advanced beings, their technology is crystalline. He said we have small fleets of these craft that we've developed based on ET technology. I would beg to differ. I would say there are large fleets of them now. And he said the military has been traveling the stars. So keep all that in mind. This is why they worked so hard to debunk Roswell, right? Because Roswell and other similar crash retrievals, and then later the ongoing interaction with non-human life forms, it created what Richard Dolan referred to as a breakaway civilization. And that is a very apt way of describing this, because the people the engineers and scientists in these types of deep black programs would have a radically different understanding of metallurgy, chemistry, physics, cosmology, just how the universe came to be, and so on and so forth. The breakaway civilization really is a breakaway civilization. And I'll talk more about this as time goes on. Okay, next slide. Bob Lazar, very important eyewitness. He was, many of you are familiar with his story. I won't go into it in too much detail. To his left is Gary Schultz, a researcher. He was a physicist who worked on alien propulsion systems, particularly Zeta Gray propulsion systems in S4, and he worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Office of Naval Intelligence is. The Office of Naval Intelligence is a special agency within naval intelligence which specializes, at least the official overt reason for existence of ONI is exploiting technology, developing technological systems, and going worldwide and finding all different types of technology which they have not yet acquiring it somehow, and then developing either copies of it or effective countermeasures, so on and so forth. So ONI is a branch of naval intelligence. They're not one and the same. And I believe his story implicitly, and I believe, like a lot of people, he's held back. Because according to John Lear, who knew him very well, Lazar was very familiar with the operations going on Mars and elsewhere, and which is a commonality that people with my lab experiences describe. Many of them recall being taken to Mars and other places. That's yours truly in the middle there, mugging for the camera. The gentleman to the right has since passed away. That is Bill Uhouse, a former aerospace engineer who worked with an alien scientist named J-Rod. It was this race of gray-looking beings at S4. He and his team were working on developing a navigation simulator based on the craft that had crash-landed in my old stomping grounds of Kingman, Arizona. And to show you the nature of the compartmentalization and need to know, it was 3 years before most of the members of his team even realized what they were working on. And he said that he worked alongside alien scientists. This particular group of ETs was called the J-Rods. And this is very common in these deep black weird science projects. They give aliens names that we would be able to pronounce, like Joe or Steve or something, because some of these ET names are literally unpronounceable. Interesting, he also said that the guy that was Oppenheimer's rival, also used to show up a lot at S4 over time. The guy that actually hired Bob Lazar, his name will come to me, claims to be the discoverer and the developer of the hydrogen bomb, but actually he stole the idea from someone else. Okay, now we're getting to the MyLab stuff. This is Dan Sherman. This is one of the most important cases that have come out in recent years. But strangely enough, it really hasn't gotten much mileage within the UFO community. Dan Sherman, for all intents and purposes, was a MyLab. For all intents and purposes, he was born into this deep black program where deep black elements of the military, aerospace, medical community interact on a routine basis with non-human life forms. In this case, the group he was involved with, he was a member of the Air Force Security Service, which is now known as the Air Force Electronic Security Command, which is the National Security Agency's Air Force subsidiary. So let's just call it Air Force Security Service. His mother was an alien abductee. He was an alien abductee. In a very early age, he was guided, groomed, and eventually shunted into this program. And what this program was, he describes it as a gray project. He was told that the name of the project was Project Preserve Destiny. And he was told by his superiors that there will come a point in time, very interesting to see how it ties in with the celestially driven cataclysms, futuristic visions of disaster. He was told by his superiors in Air Force Security Service that there will come a point in time when the grid will go down and communications and basic life as we know it will cease to exist. However, he was told, we will still need to maintain comms with a particular race of ETs. So he was essentially part of a genetics program where the Zeta Greys, again, were genetically manipulating him and his mother to ensure that he had telepathic abilities which would make him a valuable part of this future program, Project Preserve Destiny. In a nutshell, he had to sit there and look at a monitor. He'd hear a tone in headphones, and he'd have to simulate the tone in his mind and make these wavy lines on the screen flatline and go straight. And this took a long time for him to master, and then he was ready for the telepathic communication with the ETs. And the telepathic communication was always the same. It was a long number, a serial number designation followed by coordinates. A long serial number designation followed by coordinates. He realized over time that the long serial designation was an identifier of a particular alien abductee. And the coordinates, latitude and longitude, was where the aliens abducted that person, where they put him back. I would suggest that at least a significant percentage of those people in that that were described, identified by this serial number, at least some of those people were MyLabs. Now, this brings me up to the whole MyLab issue. Let me tell you what MyLabs are, my definition of MyLabs. MyLabs are legitimate alien abductees who also, on occasion, are kidnapped, trained, mind-controlled, and utilized as an operational asset by deep black elements of the military aerospace community, oftentimes in conjunction with aliens. And some of the aliens, unfortunately, are of the negative variety, the abducting variety, the reptilians. And I must stress that there are a number of these programs. They seem to be running in parallel. There may or may not be an umbrella organization that coordinates the activities of all these different factions. Some people report encounters with Air Force personnel. Others report encounters with naval personnel. Others report encounters with Army personnel. It varies. Sometimes it's dependent upon the proximity of a given branch of the service and surface level bases. Like in Southern California, for example, many MyLabs have been taken to the underground facility at Edwards Air Force Base. And likewise, some MILABs have been taken underground beneath the Naval Weapons Center, China Lake. And sometimes, like what used to happen to a friend of mine, Diane Johnson, one week the Air Force would grab her and bring her to an underground base beneath George Air Force Base, and on another occasion, the next week, the Navy would come around and take her to an underground base at China Lake. So it varied. Now, what's important to understand are we are the sum of all our parts. And what differentiates MILABs from the general population is that MILABs tend to have the DNA of not just one ET race, often as times a number of ET races. Some positive, some not so positive. Within this alien DNA is contained latent metaphysical powers. Now, when abductees are in an alien environment, whether it's an installation, a base, a UFO, what have you, sometimes the abductee will manifest metaphysical powers. They can interface with alien technology. They can telepathically speak to the ETs on board, or even other abductees. They can levitate. They can manifest telekinesis. They can emit energy from their hands, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these are skill sets which are desired by the deep black military controllers. And again, we see a historical aspect, a historical relationship to this. The Carthaginians, the old foes of the Romans in three different wars. Their cavalry were the Numidians, regarded as the best cavalry in the ancient world. The Romans themselves used the skills of a number of different tribes and cultures, slingers, archers, so on and so forth. And so this is what seems to be happening, where the deep black elements of the military, they know that the DNA within a given MILAB can, if properly exploited, properly activated and triggered, can manifest metaphysical abilities. And I'll go into more detail as time goes on, time permitting, because it's very common for alien abductees to manifest abilities such as astral travel, remote viewing, spontaneous remote viewing. I've had countless precognitive dreams. All of those things and more will be utilized by deep black elements of the military in these ops. And these ops will take place in underground facilities, in remote areas of surface facilities, or remote areas of the surface, and including off-world ops. And I'll get into more of that. Let me just review my notes here real quick so I don't get ahead of myself. Let me check the time, too, because I don't want to... Oh, okay, 10 minutes. Good. And, in the final 10 minutes, I'll talk a bit about what myself and our team in the high desert of Southern California first learned, and contrast it with what we've since come to know about MILAB operations. In the old days, what would happen, when I mean the old days, the late 80s, early 90s, this was a very common scenario. The military would show up sometimes during the day, especially if it was in the high desert areas of Southern California, these remote, dusty kind of towns, and medium-sized towns and small cities. The military would show up when say the husband was at work, and they would show up in a white van. And they would come right to the door, and they would have sometimes like a black box. Very common item described in the MILAB lore, a black box with wires coming out of it. And they would tweak some knobs or something on this black box, and they would render everybody, except the person that they were interested in, they would render them all unconscious. Even the animals of the house, dogs and cats. And they would come in and say, "How are you doing, Diane? It's time to go," right? And then they bring her out to the van, they drive away. and they eventually wind up in an underground base. Sometimes the military would show up in a helicopter if it was a remote location, a place in the countryside, and then they would force the person, sometimes at gunpoint, onto the helicopter and take them away. And there were different methods of coercion that were utilized. Sometimes an aerosol can that emitted a citrusy kind of smell would render the MILAB unconscious, and they would take her away. Sometimes they would jolt her with what amounted to like electric prod, a little handheld one that's been created by a number of these security corporations. And other times they would just manhandle the guy or the gal and take them out to the vehicle or take them out to the helicopter. And what they would do when they got to the base was, whether it was an above-ground base, subsurface base, sometimes a corporate office in a corporate building, an office building somewhere in town, which they rented out as a front, they would at times harshly interrogate these people, and they would ask them what they remember of their alien abduction experiences. I've even known cases of MILABs being debriefed and harshly interrogated about their past lives, past life as a German in World War II, in one particular case. And the person that was being interrogated was a female MILAB. Oftentimes, the military is asking about other types of aliens that the woman or the man is involved with, because as above, so below. As I'll get later on in this presentation, what we're seeing here on this planet is merely the latest extension of ongoing cosmic wars that have gone on for countless millennia. The lore is rich about conflict going back to the Orion constellation, so on and so forth. I've even spoken to people that have past life memories of being an ET warrior in one faction or another, and there are alliances, there are federations, there are counter-alliances, there are councils. That's all true. It sounds Star Wars-ish, it sounds Star Trek-y, but the fact of the matter is, and my friend Ray here later on, after the lecture, can tell you, that Gene Roddenberry got the idea for the Galactic Federation of Planets from actual contactees. And just right before we leave, I must point out, because it dovetails with what I'm going to talk about in the second half, I could sympathize why David spends 10 hours a day doing these lectures, because there's so much information. It's not for a lack or a want of information. When you really delve into it, when you spend a lot of time talking to people, you just amass over time a massive database of information that people have really experienced. This is not conjectural, it's not speculative. These are real things that people really go through. And the last thing I'll leave you with before we go to break is, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, scientifically oriented, quote unquote, UFO researchers went out of their way to discredit, debunk, marginalize people who call themselves contactees. And typically the contactees describe having experiences with oftentimes human-looking aliens. They don't look like us, we look like them in actual fact. And it would be an amiable kind of encounter where they would be oftentimes invited onto the craft, taken for a ride, and sometimes these contacts and interactions lasted for many years. Now, the scientifically oriented researchers at the time, heavily influenced by National Investigations Committee of Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, which was basically taken over by intelligence after they ousted the founder of NICAP, retired Marine Major Donald Kehoe. NICAP wanted to keep everything at a nuts and bolts, lights in the sky thing. Let's focus on the craft and pictures and determine if picture is a hoax or not. Never mind, forget about whoever's flying the craft. That's beside the point, right? So when these contactees start saying, well, I'm meeting them on a regular basis, they're taking me up into their ships, they're showing me things, they're talking about their technology, their civilization, they were ridiculed by the media. They were even debunked by the mainstream UFO researchers. And again, the first line of defense for the control system is always the UFO community itself and all the gatekeepers and debunkers within it. Well, now, fast forward to the present, it turns out that a lot of those contactees were not so crazy after all. Because to this day, throughout the world, people are still encountering and reporting encounters with beings who look perfectly human. And I underscore the word perfectly 3 times, because they seem to have a mastery of genetics. They seem to have perfectly symmetrical features. They don't have any freckles. They don't have any moles. They don't have any kinds of imperfections. These human-looking beings, they can have blonde hair, dark hair, brown hair, so on and so forth, varying sizes, some relatively small or medium sized, some rather tall. But it turns out that many of the revelations from within the deep black aerospace community, whistleblowing and anonymous whistleblowing from aerospace engineers, scientists, what have you, as well as the reports from people today having encounters with friendly human-looking beings and other non-looking human beings that are still friendly. It jives in many ways with what the contactees talked about. So that's going to be a key element when I pick up the story about MyLabs in the second half, because the negative aliens want to know about what the good aliens are doing with these MyLabs. These MyLabs find themselves often as not caught in a cosmic tug of war between 2 or more factions. So enjoy your break, and then I'm going to go and mellow out for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, James.
They say that this particular advanced race of people down there on the ocean floor, and they also have bases beneath the ocean floor, they want nothing to do with what's going on in the surface. Indeed, they have nothing but contempt for the people here on the surface for letting things degenerate to the state that they've degenerated. It's a very common thing that I hear. So that's just one example of subsurface civilizations which deep black elements of the military, in this case naval intelligence, interacts with. Now, these MyLabs are trained based on the particular skill set they bring to the table and their psychological profile as well, which ties in 100% with their DNA profile, if you will. Remember that psychology follows neurology, which follows genetics. The surface level criminal profilers would have us believe that all these serial murders, and I'll get into this more later with the reptilian part of the speech, that all these criminals, they're just suffering from some kind of psychological aberration, right? That it's just some kind of psychological disorder. They have all these unresolved issues they haven't worked out, and they're just projecting their issues onto society. Well, it's a lot deeper than that, but also it's a lot simpler than that. It has to do with their DNA profile, their neurology, their psychology, and their genetics. So, depending on the skill set of the MyLab, depending on what kinds of ETs that the MyLab is interacting with, and I would suggest that the deep black elements of the military know very well the ET profile, if you will, that each abductee in MyLab has. Just based simply on a simple blood test and an examination of one's DNA, they can have a very good idea of which types of ETs have genetically influenced their particular family tree, as well as what types of latent metaphysical abilities exist within said DNA. Because ultimately these MyLabs are operational assets, slaves by any other name. And so skill sets, for example, some MyLabs on the surface have vocations where they are in the medical field. They may be in biochemistry, they may be first responders, AMBOs as you would call them here, ambulance, first aid responders, so on and so forth. Indeed, the military controllers, the handlers, will even encourage them to become firefighters. We'll even encourage them to be paramedics. Some people, because of their state, their general state of health and their particular skill set, are only useful to the MyLab controllers in what we would call an administrative capacity. They work in these underground bases as nurses, as biochemists, as geneticists, whatever their particular skill set on the surface. They've been mind controlled, so they have an alter personality which works in these underground bases, performing particular tasks which have been assigned to them. And some people, they retain a lot more conscious awareness of their experiences than others. And you know, the kind of things I hear, I mean, you have to have some black humor about all this, right? They say, it's, you know, I have to work in the surface world, in the workaday world, and then they put me to work in this lab, you know, below the surface, and it's like I'm exhausted, I never get any sleep, and it's a very common sentiment you hear from MyLabs. Another interesting comment you hear from MyLabs is they wake up as a feeling as if they run a marathon, as if they've been run over by a big diesel truck, as if they've been utilized in all kinds of physical activities. And in some cases they have. Now, again, it comes back to skill sets, and I'll talk more about the different types of skill sets in a moment. MyLabs are utilized in underground bases, but they're also utilized on the surface. And one of the things, a commonality amongst many MyLabs, is that they have been trained to survive future probabilities on the surface. Again, it ties into what Dan Sherman was told in Project Preserve Destiny. It's what many of us have seen in our futuristic prophetic dreams of cataclysms, fireballs, volcanic activity, so on and so forth, financial collapse, whatever the case may be. So they are trained to survive these contingencies, whatever they may be, on the surface. And they're trained individually and in groups. In groups, they're trained to, they're studied, they're analyzed, and they're assessed for leadership potential. And they're put in scenarios where MyLabs will be tasked with organizing a group of survivors to carry out certain tasks. And the MyLab will say to other MyLabs, for example, okay, you will go find drinkable water, you will find firewood, you will find food that's edible, that's non-contaminated, because very often in these futuristic scenarios, the environment is completely tainted. It's a nuclear, biological, chemical kind of environment in many cases. Now, many of us that have had these prophetic visions and futuristic dreams, we've also had dreams of nuclear detonations, nuclear war, nuclear holocausts, and so on and so forth. That also figures prominently in some of the training that the MyLabs have been put through, where they're expected to survive this nuclear environment. And they'll describe having seen in dreams or in virtual reality experiences. I must stress for a moment that for the MyLab, it's up in the air sometimes what type of experience they're really having or remembering. Are they laying in bed and it's a virtual environment, theater of the mind, and they're not really anywhere, they're just laying in their bed? Or has their consciousness, their astral body, been taken to some other place, put through its paces, and made to take part in these kinds of scenarios? Because the ETs and now the military for some time, they know that we have an emotional, astral, energetic body, and they interact with it as often as they do with the physical bodies. Anyone who's had real alien abduction experiences knows that it's not simply physical abductions, medical procedures. That in itself is a level of gatekeeping, right? And those gatekeepers have in common they've never had the experiences, or at least they don't admit to having the experiences, and they try to describe it as a cut and dried kind of medical procedure kind of thing, ovum extraction, DNA extraction, hybridization. It's much deeper than that. Any abductee worth his or her salt will tell you that the experience encompasses every state of our being. Telepathic contact, astral dreamscape manipulation, stage-managed dreams, where our consciousness is in some place and we're being shown all the symbolic stuff. We're taken on otherworldly visits that seem to be in a interdimensional, out-of-body kind of thing. And it runs the gamut. It's not any one thing. That's what people have to understand. And these military controllers in cahoots with these different ET groups they're working with, they know the totality of the human experience and its potential. That's one of the frustrating things, is they seem to know more about us than we know about ourselves. They know what our capabilities are. They utilize us in a physical sense, like as combat operatives, as couriers, in some cases, unfortunately, for sex purposes, so on and so forth. But they also utilize MyLabs in a metaphysical sense. They use them as astral operators. They utilize them on spying missions as an astral operative. They utilize them as remote viewers. They have the means to transfer the consciousness of the MyLab into other beings, kind of like as walk-ins, where they take them over for a while, and their controllers can see out of the eyes of them, and they themselves are inside of some other being. The ETs do this too, because there's spying all across the board. They're spying all across the board. Because within our DNA profile, again, we have the DNA profile, abductees and MyLabs, of a number of different races. So people are used as astral operatives, they're used as remote viewers, they're used to interface with ET technology. And what's interesting also is genetics is far more advanced than people have any understanding generally on the surface. What these military controllers have done is they've been able to get into the cloning business, essentially. You see, the deep black elements of the military aerospace community have always strived to replicate the capabilities of the different ET races. They've always strived to duplicate, replicate, indeed exceed their capabilities. And one of these capabilities is genetic engineering. So what they do is, abductees are routinely cloned out. They're cloned out not only by ETs and different ET groups. Some abductees have seen numerous copies of themselves in stasis in glass tubes. Sometimes they've interacted with clone counterparts of themselves. I've seen my own clone counterparts of myself. They always seem to be younger, slimmer, don't wear glasses, but I've run into them nonetheless, right? And what's interesting is what they can do, what the military can do, is they can take the consciousness out of the sleeping abductee, place it into a clone counterpart of themselves, and utilize that clone body in hazardous training and or operations. So if the MyLab operative in the clone body gets mangled in really hazardous training or in an op, they simply transfer the consciousness back into the sleeping MyLab, whether the MyLab is at the MyLab base or back in bed, or they transfer the consciousness to another clone and continue the operation. You see, this is like Greek mythology writ large. Well, when I was a boy, I used to read Greek mythology, and to me there was nothing unusual or woo-woo about it. There was nothing unusual about all these different chimeras, all these different beings that were a variety of different races. And now, from the testimony we're getting for many years now, of MyLabs and aerospace engineers and workers in some of these underground bases, they've seen these genetics labs, and they really do create these chimeras, abominations in some cases, things that were never really intended to be alive, things that were created in a lab made up of a variety of different life forms. In fact, I knew a group of researchers in California who had befriended somebody. They met this guy jogging, of all places. You meet these people everywhere in all kinds of situations. And it turns out that this guy was a neurologist in the underground bases. And his job, and he would be down there, this is very common, he would be down there for months on end. And then after 3, 4, 6 months, whatever the case may be, he's let loose back on the surface. And you know, he ties up kind of any loose ends here on the surface. And then after his vacation is over, he goes back underground. His job was to study the neurology, brainwave patterns, etc., of all these genetic mutations that they're creating, right? So keep that point in mind, because genetic engineering means that certain attributes can be, certain desired attributes can be genetically imbued into certain bloodlines and certain progeny, if you will, to make them more psychic. For example, my friend Helga Morrow is a classic example of another person who was born into these programs. Her father was Frederick Augustus Keppars. He was a German expatriate who left Nazi Germany, went to America, emigrated to America, joined Douglas Aircraft, which later became, and which later merged after a lot of name changes, became Martin Marietta, Glenn L. Martin, Martin Marietta, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, et cetera. If memory serves, it could be different lineage, but he started out in the aerospace industry. One of his friends was Dr. John von Neumann. If you're familiar with the Manhattan Project, he was a consultant, a mathematician, computer scientist, and according to testimony from Dr. Robert Sarbarker, who was the dean of the Washington Institute of Technology, and was also a consultant with the Pentagon, with the Research and Development, the Joint Army Research and Development Board in the 1950s, and was aware of the back engineering effort based on recovered alien technology. Dr. Robert Sarbarker identified John von Neumann as being directly involved in the back engineering and research of UFO technology. Well, Helga Morrow's father, Dr. Frederick Augustus Keppars, was a friend of John von Neumann. John von Neumann, we used to come to his house. One of Dr. Frederick Augustus Keppars' other friends was another expatriate German who was a geneticist. When Helga was 8 months in the womb of her mother, her father's geneticist friend stuck a long needle into her mother's belly and genetically altered or did something to Helga, the express purpose of which was to make her more intelligent and more psychic. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Helga became a world-class psychic, medium, so on and so forth. And she herself had her own ET experiences and was involved at some level, but at least as an investigator with the Montauk Project. So those are just examples of the kinds of ops that my labs are used in. Now here's where things get kind of woo-woo, but not really. Because people have to get out of this mindset that what we see on the surface is the totality of the technology and the technological capabilities which exist to the deep black breakaway civilization, as Richard Dolan calls them. Because they have an understanding of cosmology, of physics, so on and so forth, that is far beyond what the people, the academics on the surface can even conceive of. And one of the things they do, besides off-world travel, besides establishing space stations, because many my labs report being taken to space stations out in deep space. They report being taken to other planets, and they report being taken in craft. Well, there is also literally a Stargate program, multiple Stargate programs. And these Stargates not only go to other worlds, other star systems in our plane of existence, they also can go to other dimensions. They can also go to other timelines. One of the programs is a time travel project and an alternate reality project. The MyLabs who contact me tend to be in these really super advanced weird science projects. A lot of MyLabs describe underground stuff, some space ops, combat ops, either on the surface. MyLabs are routinely utilized either as astral operatives, remote viewers, or in physical combat on the surface. They've been utilized when they fragmented and destroyed Yugoslavia. They've been utilized in Afghanistan, and they've been utilized in Iraq and elsewhere. They've also been utilized in other dimensions and other planes of existence and other alternate timelines. The alternate timeline ops tend to be intelligence gathering, basically stealing technology, stealing manuscripts, stealing documentation. They will go to these other worlds, alternate Earths, let's say, and what's commonly described as some of the Earths they've been sent to, counterpart Earths, they may be a few years behind us. And the way it's been described to me is, okay, we're on the iPhone 5 or 6, they're still on the iPhone 3. That's where they're at. But there's some technology, there's some documentation, blueprints, whatever the case may be, that their controllers want them to acquire. And so they'll find themselves in some university kind of office doing a breaking and entering thing, rifling through files, whatever the case may be, and then they leave. That's also done in our timeline, where they're frequently used in these ops to steal information, acquire information. It's not just combat they're utilized in. I know I'm jumping all over the place because there's so many different things they're utilized in. Combat is just one, and it's not just combat against humans here on Earth, but also against aliens. That really does happen. What's interesting to me is that in some of these alternate Earths, what some of the MyLabs described to me is that some of them, and I'm guessing the reason why these other alternate Earths are having these kinds of problems is because either they're closer to the galactic core, whatever the case may be, the galactic center. In some of these counterpart Earths, it's an all-out alien invasion where people are in broad daylight are cowering in their homes, afraid of getting abducted, mostly by the Greys and other beings. That in itself would tell me that at least in those counterpart realities, there is some kind of celestial timetable that those ETs and the powers that be in that particular realm are pushing up against, just as the powers that be, the reptilian overlords on our planet who work through their reptilian hybrid plantation managers who run the surface world and a lot of the subsurface world, they also are pushing against a celestially driven timetable, whether it's in the form of celestially driven cataclysms in one form or another. I tend to believe it'll be a series of events running in parallel with one another, not any one thing. And what the MyLabs describe is that the aliens, the abducting aliens, have thrown caution to the winds. They know they have just a limited amount of time before the surface world on that Earth is completely changed over. And so they're abducting and acquiring as much genetic material as possible. It must be understood that what we're dealing here is not simply DNA acquisition. DNA is a currency of the universe. Like I said, within DNA lie the latent metaphysical powers of a number of different ET races, not just one. But it's also, for lack of a better term, what we would call the soul, because many of these beings, they see us as this kind of a product of a lot of different ET races. We have the attributes of a lot of different races. And what the controllers on this planet have done, and you've heard this from many others, is they've created this prison planet grid where we keep reincarnating, coming back here, and we have our memories basically wiped of our past lives, and we're forced to relive and make the same mistakes over and over. And in the process, we create this miasma of of pain, suffering, misery, so on and so forth, which these archontic beings feed off of. These archontic beings are essentially parasitic. They feed off of our negative emotions. They feed off of the strife and the conflict which they create. And so what happens is we have a situation where we just keep coming back with no memory of what we've done before. But some people, some MyLabs, this ties into the contactee thing that I described earlier. Some MyLabs know that they have star elders. They have an extended star family. And the point of origin varies. Sirius, whether it's Sirius A or B, some planetary system within the Sirius system. Orion, very common. The Pleiades, very common. And I'm just talking about people who know that they're here to do good, to basically unravel the reptilian overlordship, help raise the frequency of this planet, because I'm a solutions-oriented guy. I'm just not here to just heap all this negativity and doom on you. I really do believe that good things are coming, but we're going to have to overcome a lot of adversity first. It's all about ascension. It's all about sustaining ever higher light frequencies. This is why the powers that be have created this perma-chemtrail haze above us in the guise of genetic engineering to cool the planet, whatever lie they're currently using. Part of that also is to conceal all these extraplanetary bodies that are in our solar system, combined with the GMO and all this stuff. The calcification of our pineal gland is all to keep us in the subservient kind of dumbed down state. But what some MyLabs know they've done is that somehow they've gotten around through a back door and managed to incarnate as a Terran, i.e. human, with some, indeed in some cases, a lot of their past life memories. Now, the people that I'm in contact with, spiritual warriors, every single one of them, they tend to have past lives as a shaman or a shamaness or a high priest or a high priestess or an Inuit shaman or and sometimes these lives are interspersed with being military people, commanders, and sometimes some of us have been at or near the epicenter of quite tyrannical regimes, quite frankly. In some of my past lives, I've helped expand some really tyrannical regimes in a military sense, and I've forgiven myself of that, and I understand that it's part of what we're doing here, because having an understanding of military tactics, strategies, so on and so forth, will be helpful as time goes on. For example, many of us are what I call short turnarounds, i.e. we passed away either shortly before, during, or shortly after World War II, which means that what better training, if you will, someone can go through to prepare them for this life now, where we are quick turnarounds. We've endured the crucible of World War II. Sometimes they're on one side or the other. They're opposames, as David Icke says. And now they find themselves here. But the point I'm making is those abilities, those innate, latent metaphysical abilities as a shaman, as a priestess, as a healer, as a Palladian healer in a past life, as a feline lion warrior involved in the Orion Wars millions of years ago, all of that is still within the DNA of people. And this ascension process, this activation process, which is happening, because the frequency, the plane of existence we're on, I think it's more than just this planet. I think it's beyond the solar system. The frequency is increasing, and with it is coming, in many cases, this DNA activation, because we have the means now to reacquire that ancient stellar wisdom and all the latent metaphysical abilities that come with it. That's a game changer. That's what they don't want us to know. That's why they keep everything at a lights in the sky level. They want to keep everything at the bogus science level, and they count on us to have this shame-based, wounded inner child where we water down our own experiences and we spin our wheels conducting fruitless UFO investigations instead of going within and embracing the totality of ourselves. We are the sum of all our beings. We are the sum of all our parts, rather. And the military controllers and the negative ETs know this. They utilize these innate abilities within my labs in their ops to advance their agenda. And that's what we've got to change. Now, sadly, when I go to YouTube and I look at all these, thank you. When I look at all these my labs, and they call themselves super soldiers too. Hey, thank you. Often as not, I see some people that are fragmented, that are unhealed, that have not reintegrated. And I'm still working on it. I'm a work in progress. I'm not going to just pop up here and say, oh, I've arrived, I've figured it all out. I'm still working through all this myself. But some of these people would presume to be perfectly healed and presume to convey their understanding of reality to the viewing audience on YouTube as if that is the totality of the whole MyLab super soldier thing. And when I listen to some of these guys, they just boast about like killing people and killing aliens, and all they're doing is basically boasting about being someone's slave, right? Now, one thing I do know is that my labs at times are compelled to do things that they ordinarily would not want to do, that ordinarily would be inconceivable to them. Let me give an example. Shortly after this whole bogus war, this never-ending war started or restarted again, a number of my labs were utilized as astral operators, and they were sent to Afghanistan by their controllers. Typically what happens in this particular project is one astral operator will be think of a command control helicopter flying over a battlefield, and they have a comm link with headquarters, and they have a comm link with the troops, the boots on the ground. Well, there would be an astral operator that had constant telepathic communications with all the other astral operators, as well as the base where they came from, where they were sent from. And what they were tasked with was to go through all the tunnel systems in Tora Bora. And of course the controllers knew they were there because it was a Saudi bin Laden group that built the whole thing, all these underground bases and surface installations, when they were still the good guys and they wanted to cause problems for the Soviets, so they suckered into invading Afghanistan in the first place. If you're familiar with the surface level history, that's basically what happened. So they sent these astral operators through these tunnel systems, and they would find these people, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, woo-woo, whatever boogeyman we're supposed to be afraid of. The irony is, many of those Uzbeks, Chechens, Tajiks were trained in the past by British SAS, U.S. Special Forces, CIA paramilitary, right, double cross. So the astral operator would telepathically say to their controller back at the installation, I see them, it's a group of men, they're just there in the underground base, in this particular location. What should I do? Oh, don't do anything, we're going to bomb them in a moment. And then the astral operator would say, well, I don't want to get hurt, I want to get out of here. And they would say, don't worry, you're not going to feel a thing. Now this is probably what happened. Through channels, of course, disguising or changing the source of intel, through channels, an airstrike was launched where they would utilize, the strike aircraft would utilize bunker busting ordnance. And the MyLab astral operator would stand there, and then next thing you know, the whole cavern system, and this wasn't just like rock walls, these were proper built underground facilities with tiled floors and the whole bit. Suddenly this bunker busting ordnance would come through and just wipe everybody out. And then they would send them to another part of the tunnel system and identify people there, and similarly through channels they would call in another airstrike and wipe people out. And for people that have empathy, people that have conscience, that's very disturbing to them, right? Now there's some, again, neurology, determined psychology, which determines, which is determined by genetics. Some people revel in that. Oh, I get to kill people, I'm a super soldier, right? But some people, it troubles them greatly. Here's another thing that astral operators were tasked with doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and also in the Balkans when they fragmented Yugoslavia. The astral operator would be floating astrally over like a town or some settlement. And in their field of vision, it would be gridded out with bright red lines like a big tic-tac-toe. And each square would have a numbered designation, D3, L4, whatever the case may be. What they would do, these astral operators would do, is they would adjust fire like a forward observer would on the surface. And so ordnance would come in, either artillery or airstrike, and then they would say like, it's missed D3, over a couple of boxes or whatever, and then eventually they'd walk the ordnance over and they'd just kill those people, right? And it could just be any group of people, a wedding party, or a week later the funeral for the people who were killed at the wedding party, whatever the case may be, whatever excuse works, right? And I know the people that were tasked with doing that were deeply troubled by it, as we all would be. If we have empathy, if we have a conscience, if we don't like being used as slaves. And so my personal beef, when I hear from all these MyLabs who call themselves super soldiers, and they boast about going around killing people, what they ought to do is figure out how to throw off the shackles of the mind control, reintegrate, heal, and utilize their abilities against their controllers, is what they should do. That's what I would do. But that's just me. So while I still have time, I'm going to talk a little bit more about one of the scenarios that MyLabs have been tasked with. And I think that my intuitive feeling talking with other MyLabs is because of their ability to look into the future and to send people in a future timeline, ops in this timeline, and their ability to send operatives into alternate realities, alternate Earths, they have a very good idea, if they game plan it out, what the likely scenarios that would occur in our surface world when the time comes. Believe it or not, many of these MyLabs for many years now have been trained to survive, indeed thrive in what amounts to a zombie meltdown. Now, let's backtrack a little bit and talk about what's been going on in the surface world. In the surface world, via predictive programming, we've been hammered with like endless movies about zombies, pandemics, pathogens morphing people into bloodthirsty zombies, so on and so forth, to the point where in America, law enforcement and the National Guard, and this is found in open source publishing, this is not found in, it didn't start out in alternative news websites, it started out in open source publishing, mainstream news, official dispatches and announcements from law enforcement and a National Guard. They're preparing for a zombie-like attack, a zombie apocalypse, a zombie meltdown. In fact, in these training scenarios, they tell the law enforcement and the National Guard to shoot people if they're deemed to be zombies. Now, zombies could be a euphemism. It could be someone who's infected with this, that, or the other pathogen. Suddenly Ebola is in the news again, right? Suddenly the whole world is under threat, right after we've been hammered by movies like World War Z and I Am Legend, just softening up the public, right? Because these are TV watchers, these are fluoride drinkers, these are people that are absolutely incapable of independent thought. So it's been hammered into their conscious and their subconscious that, well, one day we're just going to be overrun by zombies. Well, what's interesting is the MyLabs that I've talked to have been told by some of their military controllers that there are elements within the shadow government, deep black military, not necessarily their own faction, because again, we were talking factions here that run in parallel with one another. But they have their own spies in these other agencies and these other black ops. They remote view them. They astrally spy on them, so on and so forth. They know that a pathogen has been developed that will, for all intents and purposes, turn people into zombies. And really nothing is simpler, because it'll just destroy cognitive function. That's already happening with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. All you got to do is read the warning labels of some of these psychotropic drugs. It's like, geez, you're giving me this for depression, right? So we already see that it's happening with some of the psychotropics. Just a little bit more manipulation here and there of the ingredients, and then you have this pathogen, virus, whatever the case may be. And oftentimes they work in binary or multiple weaponized fashion. It's not just sometimes like a chemtrail. There's like nano elements to the chemtrail, and the chemtrail itself is catalyzed, activated for specific purposes by HAARP, scalar wave. We've all seen the sugar cookie effect. We've all seen the different types of, perma-chemtrail haze above us. And then you combine that with the GMO and everything else that's been going on. I can see it. It's quite possible that a zombie apocalypse can be engineered. Now, we've already seen people, to use the old term, become berserkers, running around naked and just going nuts. Now, paradoxically, when these guys are running around nuts and it's all filmed on YouTube, no one ever shoots it, right? Whereas if a guy's walking along with a cane, cop says, I was in fear for my life, so I plugged him full of holes, threw in another mag and emptied another mag into him. I was afraid for my life. But these guys that run around naked and just going nuts, they seem to just be left alone, right? They don't just kill them like they do like ordinary people who are just minding their own business, which to me is pretty sus, if you ask me. Okay, back to the MyLab aspect. What's interesting is that some MyLabs that have been sent in these, what they perceive to be intuitively, these alternate realities, these alternate Earths, where this zombie meltdown has already occurred, they're sent to lead survivors out of the woods, out of the cities. That's a very common tactical scenario where they are sent to these alternate Earths, and they're tasked with other MyLabs to lead a group of survivors out of the city into the woods, into the country. Typically what they do is they wait till first light because you can see the zombies better. They can jump down from rooftops, they can pop up from behind trees, whatever the case may be. And when these MyLabs are in that role, they are calibrated for combat. And they are well trained too. They've been trained in weapons, not only like surface level weapons, but quite exotic weapons. But typically in these zombie apocalypse scenarios, they use typical surface level automatic weapons, that kind of thing. And there'll be a guy at point in front and just, slice of the pie, so to speak, sighting down at any potential target. There'll be a back marker watching the rear, and there'll oftentimes be two people on either side. And they lead this group of survivors out. And they're into it. It's like they're in the combat warrior mode where, you know what, they're not going to get me. And they may get some of these people I'm trying to get out of here, but they're not going to get all of them. Right? They're really mission-oriented. Now, that's just one possibility. Now, what's interesting is I was trying to get a timeline. I'm not one to come up with timelines and affix dates because people are going to hold it against you later on, right? And a lot of people have come under criticism for predicting this, that, or the other catastrophe, coastal flooding, whatever. And, the date comes and goes and nothing happens and their credibility suffers as a result. But one of the most trusted MyLabs I've known for over 20 years now, at least, she told me that she recently, this is about 7-8 months ago, she was in this futuristic zombie apocalypse scenario. And it must be emphasized that she is utilized by a branch of the military that has time travel capability. In fact, they've used the time travel capability to show her things which always came to pass, right? In fact, one time they showed her that her daughter, who's now a beautiful 20-something-year-old, was going to be kidnapped by a guy and then sold into a sex slavery, human trafficking ring. They showed her the guy escaping with her daughter, the whole bit, in a futuristic sense. Well, long story short, she called the police. She prevented the whole thing from happening. So that's just an example of how they've shown her things in the future which have come to pass. See, and it's not done for altruistic purposes. Let's make that very clear. When they train these MyLabs to survive all these possible contingencies, it's not because they care for them necessarily. It's because they're operational assets. Some of these people were literally, males and females were put together through a series of circumstances, made to have children just to continue this MyLab bloodline operation. So these MyLab ops are generations or decades in the making. So when they're training these people to survive, it's not necessarily because they're good guys or it's being done for altruistic reasons. They're operational assets. And they tell them when the time comes, when people are being herded onto the trains, when people are being sent to the camps, when people are told to go to the hospitals, don't go. Don't go. Just training will kick in. You'll know where to go when the time comes. Right? That's what they tell them. Well, in this case, she was sent on this time travel alternate reality scenario where it was a zombie meltdown. I think there was even a nuclear aspect to it. And she was running and trying to survive with with members of her family. And she's been told, when the time comes, you're going to have to harden your heart. You can't have people around you that are just luggage and they can't pull their own weight, and you just love them and you feel sorry for them. They're going to have to be able to cut the corn or just leave them behind. And you're going to be seeing a lot of people, children, adults, elderly, that you can't help. You're just going to have to carry on, right? So all of this training and this mindset has been imbued into her for decades now, and her daughters, by the way, who are now young adults. And in this scenario, they're fighting zombies, they're running from zombies. It's a post-nuclear environment. And she said, I asked her, because a light bulb went on in my head, I go, how old does your grandson look like in this scenario? Well, he looks like he would be about 6 years old. And I go, that's interesting. How old is he now? Well, he's almost 3, right? And that was like a year and a half. That was like 8 months, a year ago. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do the math here. So if this scenario pans out, I said to her, we may see something like this 2016, 2017, something like that. She goes, yeah, that's what I am picking up. And other MyLabs have been shown similar things of coastal flooding in the East Coast, coastal flooding on the West Coast of America. When I say the East Coast, I mean the East Coast of America and the West Coast of America. Basically, coastal flooding all over the world. So, MyLab training, so on and so forth. And before I run out of time here, I got to talk a little bit about reptilian abductions and then actually leave you with a happy ending, good message. Because I don't want you to leave here thinking that I'm all doom and gloom and I'm not solutions oriented, because I am. It's just that there's so much information. And okay, I'll talk more about this later. But there's a lot of electromagnetic beaming that goes on with MyLabs. You see, what they do is a lot of the programming happens when one is asleep. So they'll beam a part of the brain, for example, the frontal lobe, which I'll talk a lot about when I talk about the reptilian part. The frontal lobe is our impulse control center. It's what prevents us from acting out in an impulsive, berserk, violent, sadistic fashion, right? Well, what the MyLab controllers do, and there's different groups that do this. These deep black groups that work, I call them project people generically, not just MyLabs, people in the Monarch program, people in MK Ultra program. Generically, I call them project people. And oftentimes, when they find out about a project person in another project, they're going to start accessing that person. So this is why they monitor forums where these people get together and they talk and they share stories. Because they know that, okay, I never heard of this guy before, I'm going to start accessing him, right? So one of the things they do is they beam a part of the brain which engenders the sleep, heavy sleep response, where your eyelids feel like they weigh a ton and you just can't keep them open. Because by keeping the eyes closed and forcing them to go into REM sleep, forcing them to be in deep sleep, they can create a theater of the mind through the electromagnetic beaming of another part of the brain. So this is one example of how they mind control someone via electromagnetic beaming into becoming impulsive, into becoming violent. With a lot of these like project people, males, you always hear stories of them like having domestic violence issues, of being thrown in jail and all this other stuff. It doesn't matter to the controllers because they can access them in jail anyway. So they'll beam a part of their brain which engenders the deep sleep response. Then they'll also beam the frontal lobe to just chip away at the impulse control center. And then what they'll do is they'll create within the mind of the sleeping person this virtual environment where they see themselves, it could be indoors, outdoors, combination of both, where they're always being set upon by crowds of people attacking them, kicking them, jostling them, grabbing them. And what the controllers do is they beam them in such a way as they feel physical sensations in the sides of their head, their face, where they're just being battered around. They actually feel this because it engenders the animalistic fear response, that fight or flight response. And in these virtual realities, they're getting attacked constantly. Just as they escape from one mob of people, they run into another mob of people, and they're getting attacked again, right? And the intention behind it is to wear away at the impulse control center because they want to use them in operations where they will have no empathy, no conscience, none of that. They just want them to just be sadistic, born killers, let's say. Okay, that's one example of the MyLab training via electromagnetic beaming. Another thing that they do is they will beam that part of the brain of someone that will make them sleep, because sometimes what happens is they're getting the rapid eye movement and they know that they're having some mind control experience because they've gone through it before. So they pry their eyes open and then the movie stops, okay? The movie stops. But then the beaming of the part of their brain intensifies because, you know, they know that they've opened their eyes. So the beaming intensifies and their eyelids feel like they weigh a ton again and they close their eyes. The moment they close their eyes, the movie starts up again. They're back in this virtual environment training scenario. And sometimes they can find themselves in a scenario where they're laying in a hospital bed when their eyes are closed, and there could be like two big TV screens up on brackets up on the wall of this hospital bed, and there's some kind of activity on the screens. It could be some kind of sporting event, like a footy game, a bunch of people running around. But usually there's more to it than that. There's an underlying purpose, because a key element of mind control is OCD, installing these obsessive compulsive disorder thought loops, and installing OCD thought loops of a negative nature, like of despair, of hopelessness, of anger, resentment, loneliness, suicide, because emotions are things in the spirit world, and that tends to lower the vibration of the person down, opens them up for more mind control, and even entity attachment, if you want to go that far. So the person pries his eyes open, and then he's back in his own bed, but then the beaming intensifies, he closes his eyes, and he's back laying in the hospital bed, medical-looking facility, looking at these big TVs up in the brackets showing some kind of activity. And there's variations of this. A lot of times what they'll do is, before they return somebody from an op, when they've either trained them or they've utilized them in an op, they'll sit them down either physically or in an astral state, in this virtual environment state, in what appears to be a darkened theater, in a big theater screen. And the theater screen will have a whole bunch of action sequences running nonstop, of car chases, of war, of fight scenes, whatever the case may be, the purpose of which is to scramble their brains up, so that is what they remember when they wake up. So they don't remember the ops they've been on, they don't remember the training they've been on. And it must be understood that, again, one of my pet peeves with all these people that, you know, call themselves super soldiers is they don't see the amount of trauma that people have endured. They don't see the amount of hardship they've endured. For example, it's not unusual for female MyLabs to be used as sex slaves, to be gang raped in these underground bases, off-world installations. And it's not unusual for the clones of female MyLabs to be utilized as prostitutes in these underground bases to be or off-world installations, right? So this is a human tragedy that's going on, and that's part of the reason why I do what I do. But anyhow, before I run out of time, because there's so much information, I want to talk a bit about the reptilians. And now, we've heard enough about, I'll just run through some sketches made by a MyLab. This is from Patty Jackson. She's in Michigan. She used to work with law enforcement, but she's a MyLab herself. That's her on the left, again, in dark BDUs, SWAT-type kind of outfit, some kind of utility belt. She's in operator mode. There's some kind of dolphin being there. There's a reptilian, and there's some kind of a guy in a lab coat. She's here getting harshly interrogated. Many abductees, MyLabs have gone through this, gun to their head, threatened, interrogated, debriefed. I told you earlier about how they utilize clones in these ops where they put the consciousness of MyLabs into clones, and then if the clones get mangled or killed, then they simply switch them to another body. Well, here's an example of that, where she witnessed like these tubes of all these bodies missing body parts, right? That's her being trained to fly some kind of craft, very common amongst abductees and MyLabs. That see, the ETs have their own standalone operations, even those ETs that interact with deep black elements of the military aerospace. And they train their MyLabs, their abductees and MyLabs, to interface with ET technology, in some cases fly ET craft. I've spoken to many people who've been trained to fly certain types of ET craft. And the control systems vary. Sometimes they look like as simple as a joystick. Other times it's more like crystal kind of controls. But that's Patty being trained. And she's also had these experiences with these orbs and these hooded beings, these really spiritually advanced monk-type beings. Okay, and reptilians, essentially three kinds. They're subterranean, they're extraterrestrial, and they're interdimensional. But they're not mutually exclusive. That's another bogus fault line created mostly by Dr. Jacques Vallée. Because when Jacques Vallée was going on and on about, it's interdimensional, star systems are too far, blah, 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 quack, 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 what he did was he neatly sidestepped the hardware issue, where over the decades all these crashes occurred and ongoing interaction with different types of ET races, right? So, and not only that though, but some of the extraterrestrial races are themselves interdimensional. Indeed, I just got telling you how some deep black elements of the military are sending their operatives to alternate Earths and in the past and in the future of this timeline. What's interesting also is some of these deep black military groups have carved out for themselves what are essentially niches, what are essentially bases in other planes of reality, not just in this plane. It's very common, especially with the MyLabs that I talk to, where they tell me that they can be trained or they can just seem to live in this installation with the military controllers and or ETs, and they could be there for hours or days or even weeks. And they will start to freak out. They're saying, look, I've got to get back. I've got to wake up my children. I've got to get them ready for school. And they say, don't worry, we'll send you back in time. And even if it seems as if weeks have passed in this other realm, when they send them back, sure enough, they wake up right before they have to get the kids up. So they have this ability. And so it's not only that they are on this plane and they have this ability, they've carved out these niches for themselves in these other planes. That's just the military. Not all the factions, I just suspect some. So some are subterranean, some are extraterrestrial, and some are interdimensional, and the interdimensional and extraterrestrial are not mutually exclusive. This came from Baghdad, this came from Iraq somewhere, so perhaps Babylonian, Sumerian. People have even encountered reptilian beings with a wand-like device. Now, what people need to understand is that these reptilians are the controlling factor. We reside within their sphere of influence. It's the architecture of control. They've done it through hybridization. David Icke talks about this. I talk more about, time permitting, the internal dynamics of how this is all done. And what they've done, and look at the picture on the right. I'm going to talk about that, time permitting. Process of elimination, statistical probability. Maybe some of you in this room or loved ones, friends of yours, have had the experience of a reptilian rape. And what happens is these reptilians imbue their genetics into certain bloodlines, and they track these bloodlines. I call them familiars, underscore the family part, familiars, where they track them generation after generation. And oftentimes these women, not always, but some of them will have Rh negative, which is interesting because Rh stands for the rhesus monkey, which they're supposedly negative from. No existence or basis of any primate DNA, so it begs the question, well, if it's not primate DNA, then what is? What is it? And what these reptilians do is they see these human females as their mate, because these women have essentially been genetically engineered to be able to be raped by these reptilians. What they do, and this is how the onset of reptilian rape often happens, where the woman will feel a sudden weight on her chest. She's paralyzed, she's immobilized, and then she may begin to feel penetration. Now, the being could choose to be invisible, and a lot of the women write these things off as being sexual dreams or something, right? So the entity can choose to be invisible in the visible spectrum, and they can do that. But paradoxically, they can leave an impression of weight on a surface, on a mattress, on a carpet, while they're invisible. So it can choose to be invisible when it's raping the woman, or it can choose to assume the guise of an ex-lover, of someone she currently has a crush with. Very commonly, the reptilians utilize the image of famous entertainers or musicians, and I've heard them all. Tommy Lee Jones, Tom Cruise, Bruce Springsteen. It really depends on who the woman is attracted to, who the woman kind of has a crush on. They will assume that guise. And it's not only a physical process, but it's an energetic process. What the reptilians are able to do is they're able to engender full body orgasms within the woman. And sometimes these full body orgasms can last literally for hours, leaving the woman breathless and debilitated, and then the entity leaves. And there are marked side effects to these reptilian sexual assaults: yeast infections, candidiasis, sometimes vaginal bleeding because the member of these entities is very large, and also other side effects, like in the days after these visitations, the women could be very psychic. Their psi abilities amp up. In fact, and I know we got to wrap it up here pretty soon. In fact, I know of a case where the deep black elements of the military shared a base with reptilians. This was in the high desert of Southern California, in the Victorville, Barstow, Adelanto area. And that whole area is a hot zone of military, reptilian, ET activity. No sooner had the reptilian left after raping the woman, the MyLab friend of mine, that the military immediately teleported her to their underground installation. In the old days, they took them away with vans, took them away with helicopters. Nowadays, they just literally teleport them. And so the moment the reptilian left, the military teleported her to the underground base, and in her heightened psychic state, her chi is amped up, they immediately tasked her with remote viewing operations in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. So that tells me that either they were aware that the reptilian had done that to her and were simply exploiting this fact, or they were working in cahoots, which I tend to believe the latter, because we had two different remote viewers, world-class remote viewers, remotely view that particular underground base, which we'd been investigating for years. And we had each of them, unbeknownst to one another, draw the interior of the base and where the reptilian stayed, where the human stayed, so on and so forth. So we know they work together. Now, if the woman is laying there paralyzed, but say she's able to move her hand and she tries to block the member of the reptilian, she will find that even though she's able to move her hand in front of her loins, she still cannot block the member of the reptilian, which is paradoxical. And it speaks to the fact that the reptilians are masters of frequency and resonance. Tesla said, with resonance, anything is possible. And these beings are masters of resonance and frequency. Now, think about that. The gal has like layers of bed sheets, comforters, and call them dunas here, bedclothes, and she can cover her hand, she can cover her private parts with her hand, yet paradoxically she still can't block the penetration. It's still going on. And one last thing before I stop and take any questions is what they can do if they want to engender the fear response. They will manifest in their full scaly glory, where the woman sees them and she's terrified. Because what that does is, you see, we are resonators. We emit frequencies. And it behooves these negative beings for us to emit frequencies of despair, of depression, of unhappiness, of loneliness, of isolation. Get us in these negative OCD thought loops, where all those negative thoughts just bounce around in our heads like an echo chamber. Well, what they do is, when they manifest as reptilians, and if the woman is frightened of them, they feed off her fear. They literally absorb the fear that she's emitting. And one last thing is, these beings have the ability, whether it's they plug into her memory banks or they plug into the information field, as David Icke calls it, because virtually all perps, serial murderers, child molesters, so on and so forth, are themselves either Draco-human hybrids or reptilian-human hybrids who operate in a hive consciousness fashion, right? And I just wish I had more time to talk about this. What the reptilian could do while it's raping the woman is make the woman relive even a childhood sexual assault. And she will relive it in real time, and she will also have the suppressed body memories come back up while the entity is raping her. You see, to me it's all reptilian, archontic inspired. Whether the controllers of a particular mind control group appear to be all human, I guarantee you some of them are hosts for reptilian entities. Some of them are even shapeshifters. Now, the thing about it is, people could be taken up as a host not just by reptilians, but by mantis beings, by greys, they can be indwelled by positive beings, Pleiadians, lion beings, whatever the case may be. See, there's a genetic predisposition, and indeed a spiritual predisposition. And this is what shamans and medicine men and seers and mystics have known all along. There's nothing unusual about it. So they have a way of engendering those old, suppressed, blocked memories, because when people are traumatized at any age, and if that blocked traumatic energy is not moved out, it stays in there to be reaccessed and be utilized by these negative beings. Now, one last thing, and then I'll take some questions, is this is a frequency war. This is why we're being hammered, not only with scalar waves, HARP, and GMO food. Everything is meant to keep us in this dross physical body, being hammered at an early age with vaccines, so on and so forth. And it's the content of what passes for the entertainment industry, where we're just being hammered by constant imagery of, like, for example, the unreality shows, as I call them, where they depict boorishness, irrationality, stupidity as chic and trendy things, right? Where it's like people watch these things, and those who are impressionable think it's cool to be boorish and irrational and basically unpleasant. Those are precisely the kinds of OCD thought loops they want to engender within the population at large. My mentor, Barbara Bartholick, talked about the Breed Out the Love program, where children at an increasingly early age were becoming more sadistic and so on and so forth. And we can see that. We can see bullying is at an all-time high, and the sadism meted out by even teenagers these days is just off the charts, especially animal cruelty too. So it's a frequency war, and it's important that we raise our frequency internally. No matter what's going on around us, we must, as much as possible, strive to maintain an inner harmony, strive to maintain equilibrium. You folks are luckier than most. You're in Australia. I mean, you can go to the Blue Mountains, you can go country, Queensland country, New South Wales, some of the places you live at are very high energetic places. And embrace your Aussie-ness, embrace the original people here. If you get a chance, study the work of Stephen and Evan Strong, where they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this latest revision of humanity, be it 4.0, 5.0, whatever the case may be, started here in Australia. The Aboriginals were the original people. And what better people for the Palladians, because the Aboriginals say all people on Earth stem from us. And even the Native Americans in North America, they say, a lot of them say, we came from Australia first, and before Australia, we came from the Palladians, Sirius, whatever constellation they particularly hail from. And Stephen and Evan Strong are in tight with the elders of this country. And the elders have said the time is now for all this stuff to come out. And they have proven through mitochondrial DNA research passed down through the mother line, and they proved through Y chromosome research, leveraging the research done by others and using it to support their case that, yes, indeed, that humanity didn't start in Africa. That's just another lie. It started right here. And what better caretakers of the land for the Palladians to leave here? People, I know that, forgive me the vegans in the crowd, but it's like the North American Plains Indians and Aboriginals, after this latest series of celestially enduring cataclysms, they had to survive, okay? So, but they were not taught by the bad ETs. The bad ETs taught them agriculture, taught animal husbandry, right? Agriculture rapes the land. Animal husbandry demeans and harms animals. What the North American Indians, and I'm sure natives in South America elsewhere, and especially here in Australia, they've been taught to live in consonance with the land. They've taught to honor the animals as our brothers and sisters. Like the academics roll their eyes when they hear Native Americans talk about brother raven and brother raccoon. They are our brothers and sisters. What's interesting, too, is the gatekeeper alien abduction researchers, who shall remain nameless, they would have us believe that there's only grays and more grays, and hybrid variants of grays. They completely just try to debunk reptilians, and they certainly try to debunk reports of human-looking aliens. In fact, they say, oh, those are just hybrids of grays and humans. But that's completely wrong. What people don't realize is there are two-legged analogs, humanoids, of the four-legged beings we have here. There are feline beings in the universe, lion beings, cat beings, beings that look like jaguars, but they're humanoid, and they're on our side. Some of you are descended from them. There are canine-looking beings, lichen beings. And those stories, people don't only shapeshift into reptilians, they shapeshift into, lichen beings, wolf beings, feline beings. It runs the gamut. So it's a frequency war. And I just encourage you just to keep all that in mind. I've kind of run over time again. And I really want to thank you for being attentive. And I really, really appreciate you coming. And if you have any questions, I'd like to answer them. Thank you.
James, you and I spoke very briefly earlier about positive reptilians.
Yes, and they do exist. They're real. Yes. And see, I've been bagged a lot in the past where you only talk about the negative beings. But like I said at the outset, it's like they're the ones causing the problems. But I must say, in all fairness, there are positive reptilian beings. Indeed, there are people who claim, I have no reason to doubt them, that they used to be a reptilian in a past life, have chosen to reincarnate in this life to help undo the damage that some of the other reptilian races have done. Indeed, if one follows the lore and see, the people that I know, they don't just get like channeling, right? The channeling they get is like, we can't talk right now, the reptilians are opening a portal, we have to stop them. End of transmission, right? The kind of people I'm in commo with, communicate with, they're plugged into some high-level positive beings. And like I said, it's conflict and combat throughout the cosmos. So there are positive beings. It's a plane of dualities. And the dualities are becoming more, and polarities are becoming more extreme. And we have to help. I don't have time to talk about it, but we have to raise not only the frequency of this planet, but the whole plane, so we can stop this endless cycle of polarities. Anyone else have a question?
Hello, James.
Hi.
Thanks for that comprehensive information. Quick question. Does any of that information that you've given us tonight conjure into as classified military secrets?
That's interesting because that's a good question. In some of the underground bases, from what I understand, Bill Hamilton is an outstanding researcher in Southern California. He used to be a Russian linguist for Air Force Security Service and the NSA, and he had his own contactee experiences. He was part of that whole giant rock crowd in Southern California when a lot of people were being contacted. And he developed a lot of sources in the underground bases. See, the Antelope Valley in Southern California is where the aerospace corporations are based. And there's a lot of underground bases there that are connected with, well, they're all connected, a lot of them, with Edwards Air Force Base, China Lake, etc. His sources tell him that the documentation that lay around on the desk in the underground bases, they're not classified, which makes sense because at that level, it's not so much classification or need to know, it's levels of consciousness, it's purity of a particular type of DNA. People that don't really have a need to know but still have, from their standpoint, a useful function, they simply mind control them, right? Because there's a lot of mind control in the underground bases. So what I've shared with you is, if it's for all intents and purposes, it's a limited hangout because it's, you see the efforts of debunking that's going on, right? Just for simple sightings and whatnot, and landed craft incidents. They can't really go out of their way to debunk these kinds of things. All they can do is infiltrate it. All they can do is send in their mind-controlled MyLabs to kind of muddy the waters a bit. And a lot of these male MyLabs especially have been going off the rails and just freaking out. I must say, and this is directly in line with the divine, the return of the divine feminine. Finally, right? Because there has to be balance between divine masculine and divine feminine. It's been my observation going back 20 years plus now that women tend to hold this together a lot better. Female abductees and female MyLabs seem to be more heart-centered. They seem to be more comfortable in their own skin, less ego-driven. Males that have been subjected to this tend to be more fragile. If they're abductees, they don't like to delve into their own experiences or into the abduction phenomena in general. They prefer to study crop circles or sighting reports or things that are kind of at arm's length. They're afraid to go within again, right? One of the most profound things I've ever heard was I attended a conference years ago. It was a Star Family gathering of the Lakota elders. And one of the Lakota elders said, "Men, you have to become more feminine." And what he meant by that was get in tune with the feminine aspect, because that's where our power is. See, because what they've done, the Archontic control system, is this, post this latest series of sexually driven cataclysms, is after the survivors came out of their caves, there was a smaller group of a surface population for the reptilians and other genetic tampering ETs to mess with. So what they did was they started imbuing their DNA and their patriarchy into these bloodlines. They imposed alphabet language, vice, and they supplanted and got rid of symbol language. Symbols speak to us at a soul, celestial archives, celestial record-keeping level, whereas letters are turned into words, which are written by scribes, which turn into laws, which are enforced by priesthoods. You see where it goes. And it's always patriarchal. Always. The witch hunts, which happened for centuries in Europe, that was hardcore reptilian patriarchy, systematically wiping out women on the flimsiest pretenses, right? So what I see as part and parcel of the return of this divine feminine is these women. The women have always been the pioneers in the alien abduction field. I'm not talking about sighting reports. I'm talking about in the field of alien abductions and MyLab research. Dr. Carla Turner, Barbara Bartholik, a lot of the early MyLabs who went public in America, Alicia Davidson, Diane Johnson, Candy Turner herself, almost all were women, you see? So to me, that's encouraging. And another thing about the divine feminine is that's where our power is. That's where telepathy is. That's where astral travel is. And I'm not talking about just lurking in the lower astral planes. I'm talking about going into the inner planes, right? And that's why it goes back to getting back into an indigenous living in harmony with our surroundings and this planet and the greater cosmos. So I don't know if I answered your question. The long and the short of it is, no. What I've received, see, ultimately this is non-confirmable intelligence. Everything I've shared, because they'll never recognize it as real. However, it will resonate with a lot of people in the aerospace community, whistleblowers, or people who work down there, as well as other MyLabs. And that's who keeps contacting me, is all these other MyLabs and abductees. Thank you.
Let me summarize what you said.
Yes.
The way I see it, after all these explanations, is that all the ETs are aspiring Spielbergs. And the MyLab people are the Tom Cruises and the Angelina Jolies of this world. The rest of us are just the extras.
I wouldn't go that far, but I see where you're going. I only point out, just to interject for a second, is that I have to direct the information towards those having the experiences. Now, that's not to say, because some of you are so spiritually evolved that, and metaphysically involved, that you don't even regard your interactions with ETs, interdimensional spirit guides, is even unusual. It's just the way it is for you. You see what I mean? So, and as a matter of fact, the people that I interact with, that's what they're like. It's like they just happen to have ET experiences, but...
I'm not contradicting what you
Yeah,
said.
yeah.
I didn't finish
Oh, okay.
what I was saying. And the Pleiadians and all the goodies up there are just the spectators watching us and thinking, when are these people going to wake up to the reality of this world and
Yes.
realize it's just a role they're playing,
Yes.
and they can opt out of it anytime they want to?
Yes, yes, thank you. And what I've come to understand, this is just gut intuitional kind of understanding, is that, again, it's an extension of these cosmic wars going way back. It's all coming down in our little corner of the multiverse. It really is, because we're talking about billions of souls, and increasingly more and more people that are essentially soulless because of all the genetic engineering, so on and so forth. There's a lot of empty vessels out there, and they wind up, in all these different politics and law enforcement. And a lot in law enforcement, a lot of them are full-on reptilian hybrids. But what I see it, and I hate to liken it in terms to warfare, proxy warfare is what I would liken it to, but a lot of the people that are Palladian contactees, who I regard as spiritual warriors, I mean, they don't just sit around in a lotus position and I mean, they're active participants. They're in the fight, okay, and they're always constantly trying to raise the frequency. What I've seen is that these different beings, Palladians and whatnot, they have infiltrated people like yourself into our earthly plane, because you tend to you anchor a higher frequency, okay? People that are of a certain genetic ET lineage, and if they can overcome all the adversity that's thrown their way, sometimes what they'll do, our contact entities, is they'll insert people who technically are part of your soul group, but they're just so negative, and in many cases they're full-on hosts for Dracos or reptilians or some other malevolent being. They'll insert them into your family unit just to knock you off course, just to chip away at your self-esteem, your self-worth, and just leave you feeling like a shame-based, wounded inner child where you can't say no to anyone, and you know what I mean? And so what happens is, when one overcomes that adversity, we become by overcoming, right? It's like Show me someone who's never failed, I'll show you a failure. The cliches are coming thick and fast now, but it's true. We think about the handicaps that we have. Just average people. And every person has latent metaphysical abilities, but they're eating macas all the time, hammered with fluoride. It's just they're cut off from the divine source. They're cut off from their own true self. What the really, really positive ETs always say is, stop coming to us for questions about what wallpaper to put up. Go within. That's what they tell over and over. That's the message. Because we're celestial records keepers in our own right. We're plugged directly in. We're a manifestation of divine source. And that's what the archontic forces have done. They've detached us from that. Right? What David Icke talks, the mind, body, computer, we're just automatons, just thoroughly environmentalized, just living out our lives day to day, no different than a fly stuck in a piece of fly paper, right? No, we're more than that. We're multidimensional infinity. And so what these different ET races have done is they've created their own genetic bloodlines, and they've had us reincarnate at key moments in Earth's history in this timeline. You see, that's another part of the solution, is we have to fix this timeline. That's something that it's a whole other subject entirely, but there are key nodal points in our current timeline, and the problem is that so many of these archontic beings with time travel capability, they've really messed up the timelines. They've created alternate timeline streams. They've really messed things up, right? So we have to not only fix the now, because all time, past, present, and future, it's the now, it's the frequency and expression of, again, the frequency war, right? But in between lives, what we do is we map out our incarnations. We map them out. And what I've noticed, too, is certainly it's not the case with all, but certainly with some, that some of these MyLab women, abductee women, spiritual warriors, every one of them, heart-centered, every single one of them, they've endured a lot of trauma, not only in this life, but in some of their past lives. Inquisition, witch burnings, the lot. Here's why. Because these archontic beings know who we are before we know who ourselves are. They know. Our energetic signature, our DNA, they know who we are, right? And so what they do is, by sticking like these archontic controlled people in our family unit, or having these friends of the family who are child molesters nearby, whatever the case may be, they want to knock us off course and turn us into wounded, shame-based individuals who lack self-worth, who are in a perpetual OCD thought loop of despair, misery, hopelessness. And they reinforce that with all the rage frequencies, hate frequencies, beaming, the media, and the fear porn that's pumped out. It takes a strong person to overcome this. And I'm glad to say I'm seeing more and more people coming into their own. Now, what's key is, I've never been like a group follower, right? I've always said I'd rather run with one than be dragged down by 20. Because when you're in a large group, it's so easy to manipulate so many people. I talked about the battleground of the alien abduction support group meeting, in some of my other talks. But that's what happens. I start talking about this stuff, someone gets triggered. One time I was in a group of people who were alien abduction researchers and hypnotic therapists, hypnotist therapists, who were all well versed in alien abductions. And I started talking about reptilians. This was the meeting after the meeting, which was always more productive and interesting. We were in like a diner somewhere. And I started talking about reptilians. In the corner of my eye, one of the female alien abduction researchers started spasmodically twitching spontaneously and uncontrollably. And then I looked over at Eve Lorgan, and we kind of gave each other that look. My point is, Goddess bless her, okay? Someone who is triggered to that extent where they begin spazzing out uncontrollably is hardly qualified to hypnotically regress and counsel people who are alien abductees, because what will happen is the entities working through them will embed hypnotic commands, programming, etc., in the hypnotic work. And so then you have whole swarms of people who come to her for help, or him, and they just get more destabilized, more fragmented, more messed up. But what happens is, amidst that group, a spiritual warrior is able to detach and break free. So what I see as encouraging is cells are developing. Cells of individuals that work singly or in small groups, and because of the internet, we can network with like minds around the globe, right? And because of our metaphysical abilities, we can work in the inner planes, we can do remote viewing with each other, we can go on Skype and do and there's a lot of healing that's going on. This is important. I wish I had time to talk about this. It's not only healing one another. I've been talking to healers around the world, and I've taken part in group healings on Skype because I tend to know people who are world-class mystics, shamans, seers, remote viewers, the lot, okay? Those are the kinds of people that I resonate with. And what we've noticed is that different beings are coming to us for healings. See, there's beings behind beings behind beings. The snake beings actually are more controlled than the reptilians. What the snake entities do, these are interdimensional snake entities that embed themselves energetically into people. The solar plexus is a very common place because that's where our spiritual will, spiritual intelligence center is, etc. And we get all blocked up. I'm one of those people. I do believe that the chakra system is a control system because a fully realized spiritual being shouldn't have to have chakras. But unlike, it's a trendy, chic thing these days to turn off one's chakras. I wouldn't go that far. My attitude is, if it's what we've got to work with, let's clear out all the blockages. Let's get the meridians flowing, right? And so what these snake entities do is they embed themselves in other beings, often in the solar plexus area. Well, more and more entities have been coming to healers and are saying, please get this snake entity out of me, right? I was with a group of people that I generically refer to them as the Germans, right? And we used to have these Skype healing sessions, whatever kind of challenge an individual in our group is going through, or if we had another friend who was not part of our group, but we can remotely heal that person. What happened was this reptilian kept showing up in our weekly sessions, and after about 3 weeks, the German gal, they were all Germans except me, she said, well, he's back again, and I'm going to ask him this time what he wants, right? Because she intuited that he was basically harmless. But after about the third session when he showed up, she asked, what can we do for you? And he said, can you please take the snake entity out of me, right? So we did. We took it out, and then it went on. It left. The next week in our Skype session, several more reptilians showed up. And they also likewise asked to have the snake entities removed. And then a week after that, get this, a bunch of dragons showed up. Dragons are real, folks. Dragons are interdimensional earth beings. They were native to this plane. What happened was, ages ago, the Dracos invaded, and snake entities were embedded in the physical dragons, and they were compelled to do things they didn't want to do, like my labs are compelled to do things they don't want to do. What happened was humans began to hunt the physical dragons which lacked interdimensional capability, basically hunted them to extinction, right? I have friends in this room that have seen dragons. I've seen dragons, okay? They're real. The ones that had interdimensional capability escaped. Now, the ones that came to us, because, I'll just call her Natasha, the German gal, who's basically our leader because she was the best. She can see in the multiple planes. She can see if there was, where I'm at in the Skype session, if there's a mantis being next to me, if there's some other being, there's a friendly ET around me. Well, the dragons approached. And long story short, we extracted the snake entities out of several dragons. They all started, and Natasha could see all this in her psychic third eye. She can see into different planes, different dimensions, as could several of the others in the Skype session. And the dragons began doing cartwheels. They began flying around in all these different patterns. They were delighted because they were no longer slaves. They were no longer slaves. They can go on and continue their spiritual journey, which was hijacked basically by the snake entities. So healing is a big part of it. So those of you that are healers, if you are confronted by some negative, what appears to be a negative, low vibrational entity, just keep in mind it may want a healing also. So I don't know how much time we have, but
we're basically out of time. Please give a big hand to James. Thank you so much.
thank you.